Okay, hi everybody and welcome to our CATR panel. I'm Kelsey Jacobson and I'll be moderating the panel today. So I'm first going to tell you a little bit about the format and the theme of the panel. Then I'll introduce you to our three panelists and they'll present for you. So the panel today is about spectatorship. It's called Theories and Methods for Studying the Borders of Audiences Together in Canada. Especially given the conference theme this year, we are focusing on ideas of spectators both coming together in terms of assemblage and the idea of what borders or boundaries exist. But it's really an investigation into methods. So the presenters today are going to be talking about three different methods of research, kind of querying them, troubling them, and investigating them a little bit further. Because we're in this online relaxed performance style for the conference this year, what we're going to do is have very short presentations. So each presenter is going to talk briefly, and then we'll come together for a more relaxed discussion afterwards. I think that's everything that needs to be said. So with that, I'm going to pass it on to our first presenter, who is Jenny Salisbury. Her presentation today is titled The Meanings of What Was Said, Interviews as Qualitative Methodology. So please take it away, Jenny.
Thanks, Kelsey. So I'm going to begin today with a provocation from UK audience researcher Kirsty Sedgman from her 2019 article on rigor in theater audience research. Sedgman writes, "To fail to listen to how audiences themselves articulate their own experiences is to shirk the urgent responsibility of understanding the ways differing individuals imagine and make sense of our shared social world." I'm going to answer Sedgman's call today with a brief exploration of creating empirical audience data through semi-structured interviews with audience members. This is a method of data co-creation, where extractional practices of research are somewhat mitigated by the agency of audience members who participate in the interview. This method generates a rich amount of data, a vast amount of data, offering scholars a variety of perspectives on any given performance. It allows researchers to consider avenues of audience meaning making that are different from their own. However, empirical interview data, though valuable, has necessary limits. It cannot be generalized. My current study into the investigations of how audiences make sense of their experiences in community engaged theater specifically has the goal of not creating an audience-based lens through which to evaluate plays. Instead, my project centers the voices of audience members and their perspectives that are often absent from theater archives. My project seeks to redress some of this absence by inviting audience perspectives into the ongoing scholarship of community engaged theater, considering what is revealed or emphasized through an analysis of audience members' sense-making. I believe that by taking time to listen to audience members, a whole variety of meanings are revealed, which necessarily complicates and expands ideas of affect, efficacy, and cultural construction. Through listening to audiences, I find that when it's really hot in Southern Ontario, it's hard to turn pages over. There we go. I find that my own patterns of thought and interpretations are interrupted and clarified. The process of inquiry has expanded my own understandings of what is possible and desirable in community engaged theater and shows how reflexivity and context expand the imaginary of theater creation itself. I stand on the shoulders of giants such as Hegel, Adorno, Butler, Hooks, and among so many others, an understanding of this knowledge as deeply contextual, located at a collision of circumstances, personalities, histories, and materialities. Qualitative interview data is a product of its context, but its strength is in how sophisticated that articulation of the context can be. Okay, I'm going to turn now to an example from my own study of, again, community engaged theater. One of my case studies is a site-specific musical by Evan and Rafe Malik called A Simple Twist of Faith. It is a story of one family's escape from Nazi Germany, and the company staged it in the historic Kiever Synagogue located in Kensington Market in downtown Toronto. I entered this site concerned that audience members would not consider this an example of community engaged theater, would not recognize it as a story of their own. The play story didn't take place in the site where it was housed. The story is not a Canadian story, a Toronto story. And I didn't think audiences would necessarily recognize it or own it as their own, which is so important in community engaged theater. However, my audiences proved me wrong. One audience member in particular articulated why for himself the play he did own as his own. So I asked him, you could understand this play as a Minnesota Germany story. So what does it have to do with Toronto and Kensington and the Kiever Shul itself? And he answered, no, there's no question. I would never think it's Minnesota Germany. It is North America, Europe, clearly. I could have written down this show easily with Winnipeg, my hometown. My grandfather came, well, he didn't come in during the Holocaust, he came in 1919. I want you to notice how quickly and confidently this audience member dismisses the suggestion that the story might belong somewhere else. For him, there is no question that this story belongs at the Kiever Synagogue within his community. It is a story that, though technically is about other people in other places, he links to his own grandfather, his family's origin stories, to the history of the very people who make up the audience of this show night after night. His sense of ownership is so clear, he feels he could have written it himself. And this argument I found reiterated over and over again by many audience members. Audience members showed me that my doubts were unfounded. They recognized the story and claimed the play as their own, an example of community engaged theater. So, in centering audience perspectives, other positions need to be decentered. And in this example, obviously, the perspective that needed to be decentered was mine. To take on community engaged work and to build new knowledge through collaboration and co-created interviews, the scholar must take a step back to relinquish some of the control to make space for other people in the project. As feminist Indigenous performance scholar and fellow member of CATR, Jen Cole argues, contextually informed scholarship is, quote, to really say where one was, who one was in relation, to make not knowing part of the story, end quote. This means the generation of knowledge is so deeply reliant on the context that produces it that generalization becomes impossible. But, as Cole argues, the gift of this knowledge is that it can, quote, be a strategy to resist paradigms of expertise, which are part of the dismissive cultures of colonial capitalist patriarchy, end quote. Understanding qualitative interviews as a political exercise that can resist, within limits, and surfaces submerged experiences means that the work is specific and local. But it is one way to reach a fuller understanding of a theatrical experience, an experience that is shaping our social world and context. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much for that, Jenny. Lots to think about there, especially in terms of ownership, of research and stories, but also of place. I found myself thinking a lot about location and community and space. So I'm pleased we're going to now move to our next speaker. The next speaker is Scott Mealey. He's going to be taking us through a presentation called Quantified Assembly, Taking Measure of Spectatorial Sense-Making. Thanks, Scott.
Sorry, I just need to unmute and do a little bit of a dance here. Give me 1 second. And great, awesome. Okay, so what I want to get into today, and I'm going to jump right in, is to talk about the idea of what enhanced qualitative research could look like, and really how it can help us build more complex story telling. One of the reasons I talk about enhanced quantitative techniques is because I'm sort of differentiating from something that Jenny already mentioned. The heavy emphasis on a lot of survey and a lot of quantitative research techniques is really on evaluation, why people value theater, why they like that show, which has maybe some value, but doesn't really tell us a lot about deeper questions about spectatorship. And I want to suggest that some of these enhanced techniques that I'm going to talk a little bit about, first of all, help us get a sense of the journey of sense making. How do people work through the sense of a show that they're trying to work with? Also, I want to talk a little bit about the more interesting story, I think, which is, what does quantitative data tell us about the way that sometimes artists make choices that rupture the sense that people are trying to make of the show? And is that good? Does it hurt them? Does it help them? So we're going to get into a little bit of that just to focus the conversation. I want to look at one particular question that I used in a larger survey that I was doing of 4 different shows, but this one is located with one particular show, Volcano Theater's Century Song. And one of the questions I asked was this: can you rate your level of agreement from 1 to 7, from 1 being strongly disagree to 7 being strongly agree? This question: I benefit from other forms of staged language, for instance, sound or image, just as much as I do from the words that the characters speak. Now, maybe you can take a second yourself. If you were to look at that question, rank yourself from 1 to 7 on how much you agree or disagree with this statement, where might you find yourself? So what we're going to do now is get into a little bit of, I'm going to talk about the findings that came out of how people respond to it. But just as Jenny was saying, most people don't realize that context also matters when we look at quantitative data. So there's 2 bits of context I want to give. One is the context of the show itself, which was really important for the way that people responded to this question. So as I mentioned, this came from a show. This question was done in collaboration with Volcano Theater. And they wanted to look at the second iteration of their show, Century Song, which was, in this particular case, performed at Crow's Theatre in Toronto in 2017. 2 bits of context that are quite important when we think about this question. Number one, there really was a one-person show in many ways, as you can see from this little sentence I've got here. Nina Burkesteff really did this show completely alone, and what's important to realize is that she expressed her entire performance through choreographed movement. Sometimes it was dance-like, sometimes it was her face on video, and through what's called vocalese. That's wordless singing. So that's really important as we think about stage language. The other bit to understand is that this show was co-produced with a theater company called Nightwood Theater, which is famous for its feminist theater, but also tends to draw a range of audiences, many of whom are used to seeing what one artistic director from Nightwood suggested was called the well-made play. So a classic drama-centered play. So now they're coming to a completely different kind of show, which very much informed the way they responded. I also want to mention a little bit about the way I went about helping understand and locate the journey. How did people begin and where did they end? So just a little bit of the technique involved when I asked this stage language question, which involved 41 people. The first thing that I want to mention about that is that I use a 7-point Likert scale, which I also mentioned. If we want to get into it later, we can talk about why I use 7-point. But more importantly is to know that I asked this question in a pre and post show kind of way. So before they started the show, the volunteers were involved in filling the form out, they answered the question, and then immediately after the show, they answered the question again. So why do that? When typically people do surveys, they just ask one question after the show. Well, what my findings have showed is 2 things. First of all, if you just have to ask the question after the show, you're really not sure why people have expressed the attitude they have. We don't know if it was the show that produced that. We don't know if they already came into the show feeling a particular way. As a matter of fact, my data suggests that lots of times the way they answer at the end is really the way they began. We're going to talk a little bit about that more. More importantly, though, I've discovered that people are not always aware of the changes that are going on in them. Partially, I think that's because people are oriented towards homeostasis, which they want stability, and so they tend to not remember much about how they've reoriented it unless it was one particularly intense moment. So it's important to ask before and after, because then we get a better sense of how they've changed. I also want to mention that what I tried to do was get a sense of context about their lives, both inside the theater and outside the theater, to get a little bit of sense of how they are framing their answers to some of these sense-making experiences. So some of the kinds of questions I asked were related to identity, for instance, gender or socioeconomic status, education, those kinds of things. I asked them questions about their theater going. Had they gone before to this particular theater company? How often do they go to theater generally? And then I asked a question that was related to style. So in other words, I asked, what are the stylistic elements that are most important to what you think is a good show? And out of that, I started to realize there's 4 clusters of types of shows that people tend to think they're going to see when they go to see theater. And their sense making is influenced by what they expect. In this particular case, one particular style became really important in understanding how they connected their experience. And this was called what I call the drama-centric disposition. So in other words, how important are classic dramatic elements to this person? Are characters important? Is the journey important? Is a narrative arc important? And what I came to realize when I looked at the data is that the more that those elements were important to a spectator, the more likely they had changed their opinion about this particular question as the show went on. So we're going to take a look exactly at those findings. Here's what's called a scatter plot, and let me explain this scatter plot, although, maybe it's super obvious to you when you look at it, but when I look at it, I see some very exciting stories. But let me give you some framework here. So on the axis on the left, that's the vertical axis, that is measuring what's called post-show change in attitude. So in other words, to what degree did people change their opinion from beginning to an end? And did they agree more or disagree more? So if you see positive numbers, that means they agreed with the statement more. If you see negative numbers, they disagreed more. And so these little dots represent people's answers. And then the x-axis or the horizontal axis represents where they sit in the drama-centric disposition. So in other words, are they more? So if they're higher than 0, that means they really value those elements. And if they're less than 0, they don't value them very much. So a basic finding is this. If you look at the average of people's responses, you see that there is just a little bit of change. So people just slightly didn't move at all, or they just slightly moved above. But you're also going to notice as you see that little bar, that there's lots of dots above and lots of dots below. And these dots, this change in the dots, tells me 2 very interesting stories are taking place. One is we're seeing that up until almost the 0 mark, people who don't value drama-centric disposition elements as much are much more likely to be unchanged by the end of the show. Now, that's not a terrible surprise. They probably came in, they like different alternative kinds of theater, and they walked away kind of feeling the same way. But you'll notice that there's lots, once we get past this point, there's lots of dots above and lots of dots below. That means people who value drama-centric elements really were moved and really were altered and affected by the show they were seeing. The show really forced them to reconsider what they think is dramatic expression. You also notice that there are dots above and dots below. That means in a sense that the show did something very powerful. It actually took a group of people that shared something in common, characters, narrative, and then they forced them into a different mode of seeing, and then they scattered this group that had formerly be cohesive. So what does this mean to the theater maker? Well, I might say to the people who did this show, I might say, I know that you value changing people's minds, having them think in new ways. Obviously, you were successful with one group of people over to the side. These people who are drama-centric obviously changed a great deal. So in a sense, there's success there. On the other hand, the people who are your normal audience members, they seem to stay quite a bit the same. Now, they still agree this is a good way of going, but you might want to think in the future, how might we challenge them and force them to rethink their typical idea of what a normal language should be? The other thing to mention is this. You see that those people who have circles below this line feel less inclined to think language outside of words is a good thing. So I might say to the people at Volcano Theater, I might say to them, now, you might be totally cool with some people just saying, I'm not into this, but you also might want to say, in the future, is there a way of easing people in to new forms of language that they're not comfortable with? Okay, I think I'm over time, but I just want to mention 3 points really quickly about what this methodology helps us with as researchers. One is, if we don't get involved in comparisons In this particular case, we would only know that people generally agree that alternative forms of language are important. We wouldn't at all know that change had taken place. So if we just asked the classic question, we would just know most people agree with this idea, which is not terribly helpful. The second thing is, if we didn't get involved in talking about the dramacentric disposition, all we would know is that overall there was some small change. We wouldn't realize that most of that change really takes place with people who are used to seeing classical theater, that these are the people who are most impacted. And the final thing I want to mention is if we look at this diagram, this scatter plot, if we haven't done this, we would miss that we actually have a very dramatic shattering of expectations, that people are forced to suddenly scramble to find new ways of engaging theater. And if we don't use a diagram like that, we realize that people are moved who are not used to seeing it. We don't realize that they are really impacted and have to fundamentally reorient where they are. Okay, I think I'm over time, so I think I'll wrap up with that.
That's great. Thanks very much for that, Scott. I especially appreciated thinking about ideas of cohesion and diffusion or diversion amongst audience members. Okay, so next up, let me just get reoriented here. We're going to have our final speaker. Our final speaker today is Kelsey Blair, and she's going to be presenting her talk on audiencing in 2020, a return to liveness. So take it away there, Kelsey.
Thanks, Kelsey. So I am a little bit addressing something that Scott and Jenny have already gestured to, which is audiences in this very strange moment. So in her introduction to Critical Ethnography, Methods, Ethics, and Performance by D. Soyini Madison, she argues that, quote, theory is at times the same as method and at other times distinct from it. Drawing the two together, she argues that both method and theory are necessary for researchers engaged in ethnography, ethics, and performance. Madison's argument can be transposed to theater and performance audience studies, where method, theory, and the overlaps between them are essential for contemporary research. So my offer for this short presentation investigates the relationship between theory and method as it pertains to defining the parameters of theater audiences in our contemporary historical moment. As I'm sure is going to be a theme throughout the presentations at this virtual conference, the COVID-19 pandemic has, at least for the moment, radically and rapidly shifted the theater-going landscape. With significant restrictions placed on the size of gatherings, theaters and theater productions have been closed, and traditional theater audiences gathered in the same place at the same time as performers have essentially vanished. Artists have responded to theater closures by turning to telecommunication, online, and virtual technologies, such as limited term releases of previously recorded productions, live streams, telephone plays, podcasts, and Zoom readings. The technologies themselves are not new, of course, but the restrictions on gathering size have increased the use and mainstream popularization of these technologies in the theater industry. This has resulted in a blurring, and one might even say an obliteration, of the distinction between conventional theater and other media audiences, which poses a challenge for theater and performance audience researchers. What, if anything, distinguishes a theater audience from a television audience from an online audience? Do such distinctions even matter anymore? One entry point for beginning to address this question is to return to a long-held debate in theater and performance studies, liveness, meaning the status of the theatrical production as a, quote, live art. Due to time, I can't fully delve into this genealogy of thought here. I can report, however, that theater and performance studies scholars who have theorized liveness, such as Peggy Phelan, Philip Auslander, Diana Taylor, Rebecca Schneider, and Ben Spatz, typically implicitly or explicitly grapple with the significance, or lack thereof, of the roles that cotemporality and or physical co-presence play in constituting the live. This line of thought emphasizes that the tangle between theatrical performance, transmission and broadcast technologies, and audiences is not new. It also prompts us to reimagine the very notion of liveness. Theories of liveness have tended to implicitly fold the question of location, that is, where is liveness located, into argumentation. To this end, Peggy Phelan, who famously argued that, quote, performance's only life is in the present, would likely suggest that liveness is located in the performance. Philip Auslander, on the other hand, would probably suggest that it's located in the relationship between a performance and the historical conditions of a media landscape. Rebecca Schneider, who considers performance and cross-temporality, would likely locate liveness in the encounter between a performance and an audience member. Drawing from these works but diverging from them, I ask, what if we imagined the live as multi-located? That is to say, as a multi-pronged spectrum where co-temporal and or physical co-presence might exist between performers and audience members, and between audience members. From this perspective, a pre-recorded theater show released online, such as the limited release of the 2012 revival of Jesus Christ Superstar on YouTube, involved co-temporality and co-presence between performers and audience members and each other in 2012, but not with audience members in 2020. A telephone show, such as Outside the March's Mundane Mysteries, wherein a single performer schedules a short daily call with an audience member, involves co-temporality between performers and audience member. And a Zoom reading, such as those hosted by the Canadian National Arts Centre, involve co-temporality between performers and audience members, and spectators and each other, but no physical co-presence. Well, in some sense, this is common sense. Such a conceptualization helps parse out the meaningful similarities and distinctions between productions, which in turn facilitates the creation of stronger methodologies and appropriate cross-analysis. It tells us, for example, that there are more similarities between a telephone play and a Zoom reading than a pre-recorded production in terms of the audience's temporal relation to performers. Moreover, this conceptualization gestures towards an already fraught challenge for contemporary audience research, one which has long been studied in television and fan studies, and which our colleague Kelsey Jacobson has begun to grapple with in her work. A single theatrical performance can generate multiple audiences at different moments in time. In auditorium audiences, broadcast audiences, online audiences, social media audiences. Knowing this, a researcher might begin by sketching the multiple audiences prompted by the limited release of Jesus Christ Superstar and by delineating the specifics of their audience focus. Well brief then, a discussion of liveness reminds us that theory can play a key role in shaping the parameters of our research projects, in determining appropriate research methods, and in comparing spectators and audiences. This is critical for a contemporary researcher, as conventional theater audiences, which have so long been a touchstone of audience research, have, we hope temporarily, mostly disappeared. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kelsey. Okay, so our presenters have now shared their sort of short talks and provocations about methods and how we might study or restudy audiences. So now we're going to have a kind of more casual discussion or conversation between the four of us. Like any good moderator, I will start off asking the first question. The thing that has struck me with all of your work so far is this idea of what I'm thinking about as sort of a reorientation to the work that we're doing or to the act of performance here and now. So I saw this in terms of, Jenny, in your work, you're sort of rethinking research and these interviews as sort of this co-creation or co-ownership, almost is what I'm hearing, especially in terms of the audience member you quote, who's kind of thinking about what story is this and where is it? Scott, I really appreciated being able to have this notion of returning to the production to see this kind of effect or change that happened. What does it mean for the audiences to come in one way and then to see this sort of divergence happen in your research? Sorry, a car just went past, so you saw some nice lighting effects. It's live to Colin Kelsey Blair. But yeah, Scott, this idea of sort of reorienting how we look at quantitative work, which allows us to look at the reorientation of the spectator during the performance. And then Kelsey, again, in terms of returning to this so often investigated idea of liveness, especially in terms of today and where we are. I think the pandemic has really forced many scholars and theater makers and spectators to sort of reorient themselves to what theater is How are we defining it? As you suggest, we need to think about our research. What's our object of study? What are our methodologies? So for me, I'm just curious to hear what you all think about this idea of reorientation. There's potential benefits in thinking about this return or reorient, but maybe there's also traps that we might be falling into where we're just sort of like reinventing the wheel. So I think, Jenny, because you presented first, I'm going to invite you to speak first, and then we'll try and make this as smooth as possible.
It's such a good question, Kelsey. This idea of reorientation and pushing our thinking to move around assumptions or definitions that we've held for a long time. So what I have been finding in my work is that qualitative interview data really pushes on this idea of expert and causes me to reimagine what an expert is and which expertise we value and which expertise we don't. So often we value artists as the expertise and the authorship of a moment, even within recognizing how audience members co-create that or create their own meaning, that they're authors of their own meaning, that is diffused, whereas the artist's interpretation of the meaning is often highlighted or strengthened. And so what I have found really interesting in my work is how even within the variety, even within the local quality and the context quality of each individual interview, that themes emerge across as audience members resonate with each other about those experiences, and how expertise can lie within community, can lie within groups of interpretation. And so the idea of expert or expertise or specialized knowledge can lie in more than one location. And so that a performance can herald a multitude of expertise in a variety of locations. And how can we as scholars articulate that, capture that, move towards that in a way that is valuable?
Thanks, Jenny. And I mean, you're already making me think of other things like this idea of multiplicity, which also came up so frequently in all three of your presentations. But before we talk about that, I did want to ask Scott, do you want to respond to this idea of reorienting?
Yeah, I think there are two ways that, I mean, it's a great question. So there's lots of ways it could be taken. I think one is to think from the point of view of the researcher. So much, unfortunately, there's this deep association in people's minds with marketing and quantitative research, which as a result guides people towards asking certain kinds of questions, thinking that what they're going to discover is based on, will people want to come back to the show? Why is theater important to these people? And I actually think that there are two better ways of thinking about what quantitative research should and can do. First of all, we should think of it as snapshots in time. We should think about, you're taking a picture of a person at this moment, and then at this moment, and this moment. Doesn't mean we know everything about that journey, but it does give us a sense of where are they going? What is different in this moment? And that's why I like to use the word story, because story emerges from multiple moments when we in a sense measure. What we're really asking them to do is to locate themselves. And I think that's the other part of it, is that quantitative research is a way of locating kind of a core way of framing yourself to life, first of all, and to the performance moment, which actually crossovers much more than people think. There's lots of crossover between where people, and it's actually, the great stories are thinking about, and I guess this is the personal reorientation, is when a person begins by a certain way that they've located themselves to theater or to life, and suddenly something that the artist does goes, that spot isn't going to fit anymore. And I actually think that's what's great about theater, and what's most dangerous about theater is when it in a worrisome way disrupts a person in a way they weren't prepared for, which is why we might do something like trigger warnings. But it's also the moment where theater does its best work. to say, no, your spot isn't going to work anymore. And so I think this is how we can use quantitative research to go, what was the spot they began with, and when, and how did they get pushed away from that? And then, I mean, I do mixed methods, so that's when the qualitative work, I think, can come in and interrogate what maybe happened at that moment. So those are some thoughts.
Thanks, Scott. Yeah, and it's such a, you know, I'm reminded, I kind of took for granted because I knew it was the four of us speaking, but I'm reminded that we feel so strongly about using the audience in our research, making space for the audience in the research, making that audience voice important, but then also being able to say, this is a snapshot in time. This is one of many, this is a starting point or a location or whatever, to sort of branch out from there. But I thought it was worth saying, now that I'm hearing everybody speak, that it's worth reiterating the importance of audience voice to what we're doing. And now that I said so much, please, other Kelsey, respond if you'd like.
Boy, would I ever. Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it's obviously the thing that's interesting about the moment is that the thing we traditionally anchor towards, which is the conventional audience, has suddenly been taken out of the orbit. And so as I say, I think that leaves us in a situation where as researchers and as audience, so as simultaneously researchers and audience members, the thing we usually orient or is part of the orbit, whether you want it to be or not, is suddenly gone, which reminds us of the rest of the galaxy of the things that are out there. And then encourages us, I think, in those ways. So on the one hand, it forces us to reorient because suddenly things are, the gravitational pull is different. I'm following the metaphor. But also, I think it reminds us in important ways that a lot of this has been happening and has been done. And to resist the urge to reinvent the wheel, as you say, but also to compare. One of my big pushes is to center audience experience and acknowledge that there is differences between different kinds of relations between audience members, again, and performers and other audience members. And that while they may have similarities and be on a spectrum, to remember to orient too towards the distinctions between those experiences as an important part of constituting both the experience of performance, but also then how we research those things.
Yeah, it's such a good point about, again, this notion of multiplicity or holding multiple things simultaneously, or maybe not even simultaneously if we want to push on temporal organization. It's making me think about a variety of different things, including sort of the fear of the anti-expert or the pressure against, you know, vaulting everybody to the position of expert. And also the danger of just saying, like, you know, there is no solid core, everything is multiple and everything is fragmented. I think I'm mostly now just targeting my own work, which does both of those things. But I think audience studies is constantly wrestling with that as well, in centering these voices and making space for all of these different interpretations or ideas, especially as we think about inclusion and exclusion. Now that I've said so much, do you folks have questions for each other or a question you want to throw out to the group? Scott, sorry.
Sorry, I raised my hand. I wasn't supposed to. Kelsey Blair, I'm really glad that you talked about this idea of liveness. I've been thinking about this with live casting as well. And interestingly enough, a number of the people who engaged in some quantitative work are also wrestling with this, the philosophy around liveness as well. And there's been a turn to sometimes shifting the conversation to being alive to something. And I actually thought that you opened the door in really interesting ways to that, because you talked about time, liveness as being, and correct me if I've got this wrong, but there was a relational turn, that time matters in the sense that one because it speaks to something about the nature of one's relationship to this thing. I was even thinking about that with Jesus Christ Superstar, because you talked about, I watched that, and then I watched it again with my family, and I was deeply aware of the different kind of liveness that was taking place. And not that there was no longer liveness, but I was more alive to my family's reaction the second time. So it was that live moment as opposed to the other live moment that mattered most. And and also, Jenny, you talked, I think there's something about resonances as well. Though it's how resonances change. And I find myself wondering, is this the same conversation? Are we talking about the same kind of thing? And even in my own work, not going too deep into this idea of pattern formation, but people use patterns of sense making in order to deal with the world around them. But they have multiple patterns, but they are more alive to certain patterns in certain contexts. Their liveness to that pattern shifts. So I kind of wanted to throw that out as maybe a cross point of conversation for us all, and to see if you want to think I'm crazy. So for that reason.
I can go. No, I agree. And I mean, I think one of the things that I've been thinking about that's sort of interesting and not unrelated to that is whether or not basically at this point, the differentiation between, which is a temporal thing, between like traditional film and or television and performance so-called is editing, is whether or not the moment, if we locate liveness in the object, is the moment that differentiates it, because we actually disrupt the performer, like we disrupt the object. Suddenly the object becomes atemporal. And if that's true, though, again, this idea of saying that a lot of the time, the audience in all spectatorial experiences is as important a part of, again, the thing that sparks us is being with other people. And there are different ways in this moment and in every moment to be with other people. So we can be with other people physically co-present, but as Kelsey gestures to in her work and social media stuff, you can also be with other people by tweeting with other people about the object that is happening at a completely different time. And so I do think there's a way in which when we have these reconfigurations, it's as you say, what do we become attuned to? Who do we become attuned to? And how does that shape an audience experience of a similar, but maybe even the same object of analysis? I can throw to Jenny if you want to add on that on the qualitative side.
I do, but I also want to build on what you said, because I've been really interested in our conversation around the idea of place. Because what the COVID-19 pandemic has done has altered what places we are in. So right now, all of us are in one place and different places. So we're simultaneously in different places. And I've been thinking about, especially because of the site that I shared in my talk, this site-specific piece that happened at a shul, at a traditional synagogue. All of the audience members were in some sense, the same place. Bricks and mortar, location, geography. But they were also in different places based on their relationship to that place. So for people who had been to that synagogue before, for people who were Jewish, for people who were Jewish and familiar with synagogues, for people who were Jewish and not familiar with synagogues. So all of that is at play too. And I think that has remained in the COVID-19 moment. Right? So at the moment, we're all broadcasting or Zooming in from a place that we have had some sort of control over. We've taken note of what's in the screen. We've taken note of camera angles and lighting. And so we've had a certain amount of control, which is a shared experience. The details are different, right? What we had time for, what our relationship is to our families and the other people we share this space in. But we are sharing an experience of creating a Zoom presence. And I think that is true with our digital audiences. They are sharing an experience of Twitter. They are sharing an experience of Zoom. And in some ways, the relationship to that place might be closer than to a traditional theater building. All of us are coming from our home. And so what does that mean? And that has different meaning than so in some ways, our placiness is closer than it would be in geography. And so I'm thinking about that quite a bit, and how that might show up in our scholarship, how we might take account for that in our scholarship. That's that thought.
I'm going to quickly jump in and say, just because it links back nicely to Kelsey's intro with orientation. So a thing I think about in some of my other work when I'm thinking about like the history of audience practices, by which I mean the ways in which audience members behave in when audiencing, is the idea of orientation, right? And that different architectural setups orient audience members physically differently in location and in space. So a traditional proscenium has audience members oriented toward the stage, but aligned with each other. And whereas an in the round has them oriented towards the stage and also towards audience members on the other side. And one of the interesting things to me about the Zoom reorientation in particular, and a thing that actually differentiates Zoom as a platform from some previous platforms, is that it gives different orientation options because we can turn off our video or on, but it also orients spectators toward, it functions more like a round, or it can function more like a round than like a proscenium. And so it orients spectators both towards the performers or the performance, whatever it's so called, but also toward each other. And I think that that kind of connects to what you're saying around also shared location.
And it turns a camera on the spectators, which you can turn on and off, but even more so than in the round, even more so than when the house lights come up, there's a camera on you as you are spectating. And it's possible that that camera is recording. So there's a level of vulnerability in this moment, and a vulnerability and a reveal of audiences that traditional theater space is often masked, which I find really interesting.
Yeah, I wanted to also jump in because I'm thinking about this a lot. I realize we're now kind of talking very much about this specific moment, but I think it's, you know, interesting and worthwhile to turn our methods to that specifically. And I just keep coming back to this question of spectators, and I know Kelsey, you didn't necessarily get into it in this, but this idea of the co-orientation of the spectator, or how we might think of spectators as part of the scenographic experience or the design experience. And given that, you know, our society is one in which certain bodies are valued more than others, especially when it comes to entering cultural institutions, let's say, that the turn away from perhaps those physical geographies has sort of refocused or recalibrated this idea of what it means to be co-present or to be together, or what audience behavior is or might be, what is considered audience etiquette, what is not, and how we're still making theater experiences together, even if we're coming from disparate locations, usually, as Jenny's saying, more disparate than we might have in a physical theater space. Watching a show via Zoom with people across, you know, the globe, and people who may not have been able to enter the theater space in which that show might have otherwise taken part in. What does that do to our methods, or are our methods ready to contain that expansiveness?
I want to jump in on methods, because part of my method in doing co-created qualitative interviews is that my audience members got to pick the location of the interview. And it was really important to me to do that because I wanted to relinquish as much power as I could. Obviously, I still have the most power in these relationships as the interviewer, as the person who has staged the interview, all of those things. But I wanted them to be in control of as much as they could. So the interviews never took place in the theater or the site of the performance. The interview was always at a site that they chose, and it was often in their homes. And now, if I wanted to conduct qualitative interviews, it would have to be a negotiation about platform. What platform are you most comfortable with? Would you prefer a phone call or a Zoom call or a Skype call? Would you like a social distancing call in your backyard or in a chosen location? And power comes into all of those questions too, right? Family relationships. Do you have young kids at home? All of those things. And all of that influences the moment, those snapshots, right? The snapshot of the audience member as I talk to them. All of those things are part of the milieu that's building that moment of data collection. And bringing the interviewees attention to that and letting them speak to that lets the story of that context really come forward, I think.
So there's a particular theory called the theory of reasoned action, and it's a communication theory that's used to get a sense, understand decision making. What I like about the theory is it says it's not just about the components that are involved in the decision making process. It's about the situational prioritizing of those components in that situation. So, you know, the classic is with smoking. I might think my parents are really important to these kinds of decision making, but when it comes to smoking, they matter, but they've gone down the list. The reason I bring that up is because I actually think about this theory a great deal in the audience work that we do. And I think about how can we capture this? Because it's not just a matter of saying these kinds of elements matter. It's also trying to get a sense of, in this situation, what is the ranking that people are doing? Because they can't prioritize everything. One of the reasons I returned to this thought was because of thinking about this topic of immersion, which is the next thing I want to think a little bit about, is that people who are involved in live casting actually report just as high levels of immersion in the theater experience that that live audiences are reporting. So obviously they're not in the same place. They're not, you know, the location is different, the time is different, and yet their sense of immersion is related to clearly something different. Both these groups are locating something as the priority that brings them into that experience. So I think that's one of the things that we want to think quite a bit about in our methods, not just to list the components that matter, but to say, how do they decide which of these components matters most, and what are the moments when that gets dislodged? You know, as I shared in my example, drama was clearly the beginning place for them. What's the character? What's the story? And then this show says, no, you're not getting that. So now they have to reprioritize the way they do sense making. So maybe, and I can throw that out to you, how do we go about understanding the ranking of matter? Or maybe you want to push back on that idea.
I can jump quickly. I mean, I think one thing too, which kind of speaks to it, Scott, is also one of the things about being a bit jolted by a reorientation that we're currently in is also, for me at least, encouraging me to ask different kinds of questions about what kind of situational factors might have previously been both barriers to access, barriers to situations, and also or the opposite of a barrier, access to situation, right? And whether or not, so things like, what does it mean to be for a different kind of, how are we accounting for as researchers, what it means for specific kinds of bodies to enter specific kinds of locations and architectures. And because of the, you know, the conditions of often spectating now at home or wherever that might be, whether for some bodies and some persons that feels like a safer space, whether it feels less safe because of the possible intrusions. And if there's a distinction between those in terms of the ranking, in terms of an ability to immerse, because an ability to immerse is a little bit based on an ability to enter flow, which is based on a degree of safety. What then does that tell us about the ways in which physical locations are functioning or were functioning, and what does it tell us perhaps about the way home is functioning? Well, that's not going to be evenly distributed across persons and demographics.
So I will say I'm just keeping an eye on our time here, folks. So as much as I would enjoy to continue talking for a long, long time, I feel for our audiences, imagined or otherwise. So maybe I'll just ask if anyone wants to offer a final provocation or thought, or, you know, what's next? What do we do moving forward? That's an impossible question, but you're smart people. Maybe you can think of something.
Well, Scott and Kelsey, what I liked about your last two provocations so much was the idea of accounting for previous knowledge, accounting for structures of meaning making, and accounting for audience members not even being aware of which things are taking precedence in a moment of meaning making. So we talk about people who reflect that they are having theatrical immersive experiences as powerful as previous ones that were geographically based. Well, a lot of that has to do with how familiar you are with the platform. So me using Twitter versus my grandmother using Twitter are going to be deeply different performative moments because of our familiarity with the platform and our comfort with social media in general, putting things out into the universe that anyone can find at any time. And so when we come to research methods, is how do we account for individuals' level of knowledge and their awareness of that knowledge? And how can we do that in a way that leaves space for interruptions, but also for jumps, right? That different things are going to have different priorities so quickly that it'll be hard to negotiate in any given moment which one is top. That's my thought on that.
My final thought is going to be schlocky and be like, I think next steps are come join us at the Center for Spectatorship for Conversation. Does this interest you? We're interested in talking about it further. And I think particularly for us as a panel of people is quite, even though my tongue is a bit in my cheek there because it's, a little bit whatever, but also I think it's a moment that's exciting for audience research because there's a reorientation towards the object and the audience, and we're excited to have those conversations. We as a group will continue to host them. So to the people out there, come and join us. We would love to chat with you.
Yeah, and just to pick up on that, I really appreciate you turning it that way, because to say to people who are interested in that, I would say I've come to think of audience research also as oriented to a different mode of working together with other researchers. I think we have discovered that the value in leveraging other perspectives, other expertise, actually is what is going to deepen the work, and perhaps offer it an opportunity to deepen this kind of work, perhaps more than other kinds of work, because it doesn't all depend on one person's ability to collect and synthesize understanding. And I know and many of you have had really great encounters with different kinds of researchers to think about spectatorship. And you don't have to be an expert in everything to try other methods. You just need to create conditions where you can collaborate with someone. So I guess that's the other thing that I might want to emphasize as well. Be open to the idea of stepping into something you're unfamiliar with, and just find good partners. And if you're not sure how to do that, I think we could probably point you to good partners. So, yeah.
Thanks, Scott. I think that was so nicely put, this kind of inherent sense of multiple perspectives, collegiality, relationality that I think our field invites. And I know, or at least I hope, our Center for Spectatorship and Audience Research also tries to invite. So now you've gotten our product pitch. We also hope that you will come join us. And otherwise, thank you to the three of you for your super engaging panels or presentations, and then also for this discussion afterwards. This is the end of our presentation.
Thank you, everyone.